talked about sort of the basic philosophy of emptiness. I use the 6 examples to illustrate what is the meaning of that something cannot be found when we search for it. What is the meaning of lack of inherent existence? Because this is really the central insight of the middle way philosophy. Everything else is sort of extending that same insight to many different examples and many different concepts that we have about things. I mentioned that Nagarjuna has his main text, Root Wisdom, which is 27 chapters. And each chapter is called examining something. So the first chapter is examining conditions, and then examining the comer and the goer, and then examining the sense powers, and then examining the aggregates and so forth. So it's applying this same logic to many, many different aspects of our experience. And so if the main thing is if we can understand that logic, then we can start to think about how it's meaningful in many different ways. So then I talked about some of these unresolved issues in science, which are very broad topics about the existence of the universe, the origin of life. So now I'm going to talk about something a little more direct about human psychology and how this emptiness philosophy can be applied to that. And then after that, I want to talk a little bit about the Buddhist theory of karma, because as I said, I think that's very important in terms of why emptiness arose. Why did this philosophy arise? What were they trying to explain? And then once we finish that, we can actually get into talking about the text itself, the 70 stanzas, and going through the different verses that Nagarjuna composed. So I will share the presentation again. Can you see this now? Yeah, you can all see it. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so after Henry Stapp, now we have psychology. So you see here, I've presented this book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I think maybe a lot of you may have read this book. It was a very popular book. And so I don't mean to suggest that this is the only way that Buddhist psychology can be applied to modern psychology. But the reason I chose this book is because this was one of the most important psychology books of the last decade. The author, Daniel Kahneman, actually won the Nobel Prize for his work. And it's considered, this is cutting edge psychology. And so I want to show that when we talk about emptiness and the psychology that was developed in ancient India, it actually has a lot of similarities with what's being developed now. So there's important differences, and I'll talk about some of that too. But I think it's important to see that this is very practical applications, and also that it's unfortunate if these ancient schools of thought get ignored, because we can see that a lot of the insights they have are very relevant, and a lot of the questions that psychologists are grappling with actually were questions that were answered in different ways by these ancient philosophers. And most of these psychologists, with Daniel Kahneman, I don't get the impression from reading his book that he knows anything about Buddhism. And I also get the impression that we'd say he's a hardcore materialist, as I talked about this morning, that this view that the mind is a product of the brain, and that any kind of other phenomenon like psi or ghosts or reincarnation, it's just bogus and it's not within the realm of science. But even within the materialist philosophy, there's still a recognition of the way that our mind creates our experience, and that our experiences of happiness and suffering are very much dependent upon how we think, about things, how we conceive of things. So first, in his book, he talks about we call the experiencing self versus the remembering self, and the stories that we tell ourselves about our lives and ourselves. So the experiencing self is really just our gross physical experiences of pleasure and pain, or even to some extent, our mental experience. I like doing this, I don't like doing that. So most animals, for example, they're just motivated by experience. They just want to experience pleasure. They don't create a whole construct an entire story about their lives. But human beings do that. And this is what we call the remembering self. We construct an entire story about who I am and what gives meaning in my life. And this really becomes more important than our experiencing self for most of us. And most of us don't mind experiencing some pain, discomfort sometimes, if we can see it as meaningful in some way. If we think that doing this is going to bring us greater pleasure in the future, or if we think that doing this, is meaningful in that, it brings happiness to others, it's beneficial for others, or some people have philosophies, or religions. They think that I'm undergoing this spirit experience for the sake of purifying, or for the sake of, getting closer to God, or whatever that might be. So in that way, this is much more powerful than our attachment to pleasure and pain, although that is still a motivating factor for human beings. So we recognize, or he recognizes also, that these stories we tell ourselves about who we are, in some sense they're false. They're a made-up story. I'm this and this person. It's not that it's, and some stories are definitely closer to the truth than others. But we sometimes forget that we're constantly making up this story. And probably the most devastating thing that can happen to a person is if their narrative of their life loses its meaning, if they're no longer able to construct a meaningful sense of who I am and why I'm here. This is often more devastating than people who have accidents. They lose their loss of their movement of their legs or arms. Or even if they do have accidents, it's not so much the physical pain, it's that I no longer can conceive of myself. I was a construction worker and that was all I did with my life, and I can't move my legs anymore. So who am I? What do I do with myself? But if we lose our sense of what's the purpose of my life, why am I here? This is often what leads people to suicide, or just that from the beginning, they can't construct a very solid sense of self. This is a very interesting thing, because in psychology, we talk about the sense of self as a positive thing. And then in Buddhism, it says that there's no self. So some people think that these are incompatible, that Buddhism is against psychology. But I think it's somewhat different. There's a psychologist in America that some of you might know named Jack Engler. He's also a Buddhist. He was a friend of Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield, some of these early Buddhist teachers in America. And he famously said, based on his research both into psychology and Buddhism, that you can't become nobody until you become somebody. Right? Yeah, you have to become somebody before you become nobody. That the point is that when we talk about constructing a coherent sense of self in psychology, it's talking about becoming a mature human being, that you have a sense of stability in your life. And the opposite of that would be somebody who's just very mentally unstable and is constantly going through phases of depression, manic episodes, all kinds of things, that they can't kind of get a hold on their life and do something stable over a period of time, or find some sense of meaning. What am I doing? And Buddhism is not saying we should all just go crazy and be depressed all the time, or be out of touch with reality. So you need to have that in order to then really do spiritual work, which implies then getting deeper into who I really am. Starting to deconstruct this sense of self, but without, this is why in Buddhism there's often warnings. Like the warning I talked about earlier is very relevant. Those who hold emptiness wrongly, it's like wrongly handling poisonous snakes, that you destroy your sense of self. And some people actually do go crazy through meditation because they push too hard. I'll talk, especially as I mentioned on the last day, about how to avoid these pitfalls, what we need to do. So there's a balance that's struck, but if we get too strongly attached, and I think with some psychology, there's too much of an emphasis on just have a sense of self as the most important thing, and therefore making that too strong and thinking this is really who I am. It's possible to go beyond that and to start to deconstruct these stories, because in some sense the stories we tell ourselves are actually harmful. They can lead us to greater suffering. So then he talks about duration neglect, which is very close to Buddhist philosophy. The idea that we overestimate the importance of things based, that something is something we might experience pleasure for a very short time, but we go to incredible ends to achieve that short experience of pleasure. And actually, we probably suffer more trying to achieve it than we do, by experiencing the pleasure. So for example, somebody who drinks alcohol, they experience this blissful sensation of being intoxicated, as I mentioned earlier, for a short time, then they have a hangover the next day. and then eventually they could develop very serious illnesses. The examples he gives that are based on experiments, one is people undergoing a colonoscopy, which was a very uncomfortable procedure, especially in the older days when some of the anesthetics weren't as good. So they interviewed some people, and in some cases, the person was, for example, in the colonoscopy for half an hour, and it was intensely painful the entire time. A second person underwent a 1-hour colonoscopy, and the half hour was just as painful as the first person's, and then the second half hour was slightly less painful. So of these two experiences, it should be quite obvious that the half hour of intense pain is preferable to half an hour of intense pain and half an hour of moderate pain. Yet in remembering it, the people who remembered the 1-hour procedure were much more, reported much less discomfort because they only remembered the ending part and more clearly. And likewise, they actually did an experiment to make this very direct, to where people would put their hand in a cold water, which was not dangerously cold, but uncomfortably cold. And similarly, they'd heat their hand in the cold water for half an hour and then take it out. Or somebody else would keep it for half an hour, then they'd make it slightly warmer, so it was slightly less painful, and keep it for another half an hour. And again, people who experienced this way, the second way, reported less discomfort. So it's showing that we overestimate or underestimate the power of experiences based on what we can remember about them. So they say the remembering self. We construct a particular narrative. And from this leads into what he calls it, the next step, he calls miswanting. This actually he attributes to another psychologist named Daniel Gilbert at Harvard, but he borrows this term from him, which he says, bad choices that arise from errors of effective forecasting. So basically we overestimate how happy something is going to make us. We think that if I had this thing, I would be happy forever, or very, very happy. So for example, he says somebody who lives in a cold climate thinks I could move to California and I'd be happy. But they move to California and for a month they're really happy because they're always thinking about how sunny it is. But eventually they don't think about the sun anymore because it's always there. And then they're just as unhappy as before because they don't spend that much time thinking about how warm it is. So this is very close to, in Buddhist psychology, when we talk about things that are actually in the nature of suffering, considering them to be in the nature of happiness. We call it the suffering of change. That we think that this is going to bring me happiness, but all it's doing is just changing my experience. So at first it's experience as happiness, but after a time it's an experience of suffering. I go to California and at first I'm very happy, but after a year I'm too hot and I want to move somewhere cold. So it's always thinking that something else is going to be happier. And then the fourth he calls the focusing illusion. Nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you are thinking about it. So this is again very similar, that we exaggerate the qualities of things. We make this into a huge problem when it's really just a little problem. So the question then, what does that have to do with emptiness? As I'll talk about in one of Nagarjuna's verses, he talks about the stages of the development of afflictions. It starts with thinking things that truly exist. That's the basis for everything, this ignorance. So for example, I think that this cake in front of me is truly existent. I don't actually consciously think that, but it's underlying my experience. On that basis, then I start imputing other factors on it. I say, this cake is so tasty, it's so wonderful. I can't wait to eat this cake. And then I can't think of anything else, and I'm trying not to eat it because I don't want to eat it because I know it's going to be unhealthy, but I can't stop thinking about it. And eventually I give in and I eat it. So that's starting from this first basis of actually holding it to exist in a particular way that it doesn't. And then on that basis, imputing more and more qualities onto it. So I'll talk about that more in detail later, but just to point out that it's, Nagarjuna's philosophy is very similar here to Daniel Kahneman's philosophy. And then at the end of one of his chapters, Daniel Kahneman, he likes to give these kind of quotations just to give us an idea, like an example of how this might work. So this first one, especially in terms of how life is experienced as a story, he is desperately trying to protect the narrative of his life, of a life of integrity, which is endangered by the latest episode. So we can see that what's really important to many people is their sense of their self and that being existing in a certain way. So that when that gets threatened, it's much more threatening than physical pain in a lot of ways. And this is why I say that it's dangerous, because we get very attached to a particular sense of who I am. So then when that is threatened, I'm a wonderful father, and then my daughter dies, then it can be heartbreaking. It can end the feeling like I have any purpose in my life. It's not that I don't care for my daughter and I don't raise her properly, but if I get too attached to this is who I really am, then it's only setting the stage for suffering in the future. Next, we talk about duration neglect. The length to which he was willing to go for a one-night encounter is a sign of total duration neglect. This is again what I said before, that people get very, very attached to a particular experience that doesn't really bring very lasting happiness, and think if I just had that one time, I'd be so happy. And they go to great lengths and spend a lot of money and might even destroy their reputation to do something that doesn't really last at all. The next morning, you might forget about it. Next, I think is sort of just a silly example, but it's something to think about. You seem to be devoting your entire vacation to the construction of memories. Perhaps you should put away the camera and enjoy the moment, even if it is not very memorable. So we see this sometimes with tourists. They walk around with the camera and you're not really experiencing the present time. So I think this is kind of an extreme of grasping a true existence. It's like we get so fixated on things as existing in a solid way that we're trying to preserve them as if we could somehow preserve the experience forever. And then we don't even experience it now when it's happening. And then fourth, she is an Alzheimer's patient. She no longer maintains a narrative of her life, but her experiencing self is still sensitive to beauty and gentleness. So we can see here what happens when we lose this remembering self. And then people are experiencing the world almost like animals. I mean, this is not meant in a derogatory way, but in the sense that it just becomes about one moment to the other. What makes us human is our sense of memory. Without that, we don't experience the world in a coherent way that we can then construct a sense of who I am and a sense of what's meaningful in my life. So I think, in a lot of thought within both modern science and modern psychology, there's a sense that we have this psychology and we have this cosmology of the universe, but they're basically unrelated. We say that a lot of scientists will argue that the universe is just meaningless. All these meanings that we make into things, it's just our human kind of tendency to do that, but it has nothing to do with the way the universe really exists. The universe is just cold and empty and doesn't care about us. In contrast to the old religious view, when everything was an act of God. If we look at people in, say, the 16th century in Europe, they lived their life in a very different way. If they heard thunder in the distance, they immediately thought God is trying to say something to me. Interpreted everything, and when there was an earthquake, it was because God was punishing us. So that is being rejected in science, that it is not somebody just making all these experiences for us. And therefore, they go to an extreme of saying, therefore, there's no connection whatsoever. But in Buddhism, there's an understanding that the psychology and the cosmology are connected. That there's some connection between my experience, how I construct my experience, and what actually is happening in the world and how the universe evolves. It's not that it's all just meaningless. It doesn't exist. It's not that somebody created it in a particular way, but there's a connection between things. We might think, oh, I'm very small and the universe is very large, but actually the universe, is only being experienced in a particular way by me or by another person. So in that sense, small and large is just relative. To say that something is more important or has more impact on existence because it's a big object, it doesn't necessarily mean that. The sun, as I talked about earlier with the color red, is there even the color red until anyone is experiencing it? And as things like the sun even exist, without somebody to have it experience it in a particular way. So that will come into now as I talk about karma. So this is the Buddhist theory of how the universe formed and why we experience things in a particular way. And I say Buddhist theory, something the Buddha taught. So it's accepted by all Buddhist schools. And here we have the scholar Vasubandhu in his text Treasure of Manifest Knowledge. From karma, varied worlds emerge. So we see the formation of the universe. And in Buddhism, it's specifically in this text in Treasure of Manifest Knowledge, you see this is the first verse of chapter 4. In the rest of chapter 4, he goes on to explain how the universe forms according to Buddhist teachings. That the universe goes through cycles. So something like the Big Bang is very compatible with the Buddhism as long as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, as long as it's not the first Big Bang. The universe goes through cycles of creation and destruction based on the karma of the beings who are going to inhabit that universe. And here we have the Buddha saying specifically, although 100 aeons pass, beings' karma never goes to waste. Conditions meet when time is right. Results will ripen from the cause. So somehow it seems that beings create actions. We say karma, it just means action. And then that creates an imprint, which is experienced later as an event, as something happening in the universe or in one's own experience in one's life, in one's mind. And I also quote the Buddha just because I want to emphasize that this was the Buddha's teaching. There are actually people today who argue that this was not the Buddha's teaching. And I think this comes from very much that there's a wish that this wasn't the Buddha's teaching, because a lot of people get a lot out of Buddhism and out of mindfulness meditation and other aspects of Buddhism that are compatible with the materialist philosophy. And they don't like the fact that the Buddha did not teach a materialist philosophy because they think that contradicts science. So there's actually a very strong movement about that. Many of you might know about this. And therefore argue that these teachings of karma were added in later. But I think, doing historical analysis of the Buddha's teachings, it's very clear that the Buddha taught about karma. We can argue that he was wrong. That's a valid argument. But I think to say that it's not actually in his teachings, it was very clear, given historical analysis of texts and the history of ideas within Buddhism, that this was actually taught by the Buddha, and that he said that beings experience karma from one life to the next. But he didn't say so clearly how that happens. He didn't talk a lot about philosophy, and so it was left to later philosophers of Buddhism to try to interpret this and come up with a coherent philosophy to explain, well, what is karma and how does it function? How is it that there's no inherent self migrating from life to life, but at the same time, there's somebody who experiences pleasure and pain as a result of virtue and non-virtue. So there were essentially 4 schools of thought in ancient India, and actually there were a lot more than just 4, but in Tibetan Buddhism, we generally narrow them down to 4 and group them into 4 categories make it a little simpler to understand. So I'll go through the first ones just very briefly, but to give you an idea of the different ideas that arose. So first was the Great Exposition School, which called this non-wastage, like a receipt on a loan. So their idea was that if I create an action, say I kill somebody, a very negative action, then at the same time as I'm creating that action, as I'm doing that physical thing, then it creates another thing called non-wastage. It's actually a functioning thing. It's not a physical thing, but it exists, in a non-manifest way, and that stays on my mental continuum. So we say like a receipt on a loan. And there are some schools of thought, like in Hinduism also, that karma, it's like somebody in heaven that writes down, he did this such and such action, and then that's official and it's there, and therefore later on then that comes back to you because it's been written down somewhere. It's a way of thinking about it. Therefore we can say that there's a connection between the past and the future. But there's problems with this philosophy, especially where is this? What is this thing, non-wastage? How is it stored? As I talked about earlier about memory, I think this is very similar to talking about how our memory is stored. And when I come to the Prasangika, or the consequentialist description, I think they understand memory as very fundamental to how karma functions. And they don't like this idea of non-wastage because it's very arbitrary. It's just sort of positing something because you need to posit something. But it doesn't really, it's very hard to make a coherent philosophy about how that happens. There's all kinds of problems with it, especially if we say somebody in the sky is writing something. How does that work? Is there some lawmaker in the universe that's just punishing people for behaving in a particular way? So then we have the sutra following school. So I'm not going to talk too much separately about them because their theory of karma is not so different from the Great Exposition School. Their theory of the mind is much more complex. But since that's not the main focus right here, I won't get into it, but I just wanted to mention because I say there's generally 4 schools and there are one of them. But then we have the mind-only school, which comes to a much more subtle understanding of karma. It's actually very helpful. In the monastery, we study this extensively because it's understood that although this is not the view that we ultimately accept, it's a very helpful way to think about things. So the mind-only school talks about the mind basis of all, which is a part of the consciousness. So it's very similar in a lot of ways to what we call unconscious. This is why I have this picture here of the conscious, the unconscious, the mind. They actually explicitly talk about this, that the conscious mind, they don't say conscious, but they say manifest mind, is only a very small piece of our mind. And most of this is at the non-manifested dormant level, very similar to unconscious. And this is where all these seeds are stored. They also call it the storehouse consciousness. Every time we do an action on the conscious level, on the manifest level, it's simultaneously making this imprint. And so the understanding is that this subtle mind, the mind basis of all, it was called basis of all because it's the basis of all experience. Everything we experience is like a wave. They say this is like the ocean, and we're just experiencing the waves that come up. So therefore, both an external object and an internal experience are both waves. We experience them as separate, as dualistic, but actually they're both coming from the same source. So this is why it's called mind only, because everything ultimately comes from the mind. A lot of modern philosophies will say that the universe is just physical and mind evolved from matter. But here it's quite the opposite, that mind is fundamental and the universe evolved from mind. It's a manifestation of mind. There's some important differences also between their understanding of the unconscious mind and some in psychology. One of the important differences is that there's an understanding that this unconscious mind that we have now, it's not just happening randomly. So especially like with Freud and his theory of id, superego, ego, and id, which is mainly discredited in most psychology these days, but it still has some influence, and it's still similar to some modern psychology. The idea that we have these desires that just come out of nowhere. They might have biological roots. They might have to do with things that we experience on a sort of pre-conscious level, and then they make us think a certain way unconsciously. But it's not so logical. Whereas here, it's experienced as our unconscious mind is very illogical or random. But that's only because we don't experience the totality of who we are. All of the things that are experienced in our unconscious mind are coming from our past lives, and they're coming there based on particular actions in the past. It's everything is interconnected, and if we understood it, and if we could understand it much more in its totality, it would make sense, and our experience would make sense. And then the second thing is that it is possible to do that. Again, Freud in his philosophy was actually against meditation. He thought that it was a kind of a way of escaping from the world. And he didn't think that there was anything you couldn't actually rid yourself of all these unconscious impulses. You could just learn to manage them. But in this school of thought is an idea that we can meditate and actually transform this. And then this is another thing that's very different from Freud, is that we can transform it completely. And the mind basis of all actually becomes the mind of the Buddha. It's like it has the potential to become an enlightened mind if we can gain full power over it. The problem is now that we only experience things in a very fragmented way because we're only experiencing a very small part of our mind. And so this is as I say, it's a wonderful philosophy. And I mentioned earlier Asanga, the founder of the Mind-Only School. His texts are extraordinary. He was really a genius, and it's something really worth studying about. But in the middle way philosophy and Nagarjuna's philosophy, this is rejected. It's not rejected that we have dormant states of mind, and it's not rejected that we are experiencing imprints of karmic actions from the past. But what's rejected is that they're going too far in making the mind the truly existent thing, the basis of reality. In the middle way school, there is no truly existent thing. Mind and matter exist in an interdependent fashion. One is not more real than the other, but ultimately neither is findable. If you actually tried to find something, you can't find it. In the mind-only school, if we really look closely, we find that everything is mind. But in the middle way school, if we really look closely, we find that it's empty of anything findable. Also there's an understanding that when in the mind-only school, it says that there is no external phenomena. I mentioned earlier about the color red. That ultimately what we say red, it's only an experience in mind. But in the middle way school, again, they say this is going too far. Because to say there's no external phenomena, but there's only internal experience, then there's no basis for saying it's internal. To be internal, it only has to be internal in relation to something that's external. So conventionally, there has to be both external and internal, but they exist in a related fashion. Neither exist from its own side, because nothing can be external without there being internal. So conventionally, we can talk about, the color red is an external thing. But when we really try to pinpoint what it is, in isolation from other things, we can't find it. So then we have the middle way school. And within the middle way school, we have both autonomy school and consequentialist school. These are two different interpretations of Nagarjuna. So the middle way autonomy school, which was founded by Bhavaviveka, talks about seeds from the mental consciousness. That the way karma functions is that when we talk about who I am not my body. It's the mind that is the person, the mind that reincarnates. And the mind carries seeds from life to life, and these ripen. But it's not that it's not the mind basis of all, because it's still, it's not something that's totally separate from our normal experience, whereas the mind basis of all is considered something completely inaccessible. It's our ordinary experience that this continues, this stream of consciousness continues and carries these seeds into the next life, and these ripen as experiences. So when we get to the next school, the consequentialist school, which was founded mainly by Chandrakirti, but also by Buddha Palita, another great interpreter of Nagarjuna, who came before Chandrakirti, but Chandrakirti was more explicit in explaining these things. Chandrakirti rejects this interpretation because he says that the mind is also not the person. If you think that the mind is the person, you've misunderstood the Buddha's teaching, because the Buddha said there's no self. So all of these previous teachings, all these previous schools, are misunderstanding what the Buddha said. The mind's only school, their mind basis of all that they're talking about, it's like a self. It's too close to the Atman that's talked about by the non-Buddhist schools. And likewise, saying the mind is the self, it's implying that when you search for the self, you can find it. I talked about this earlier. If my mind is myself, then why do I say I'm sick when my body is sick? And if my mind is myself, is the mind a findable thing in and of itself? Can I point to it and say, that's my mind? Where is the mind? It also is an issue of time, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but that our experience of time in all of these previous examples, they're trying to answer a question with a fundamental flaw. They're saying, how is it that an earlier action can make an imprint that is experienced later, as though time is passing in some inherent way, and there's a person that's traveling through time and carrying these imprints. So next we have Chandrakirti's interpretation, the consequentialist distinction, we say, because it's his distinct interpretation of karma. So in his text Supplement to the Middle Way, he says, because it doesn't cease inherently, it's potent, even with no basis of all. For some, since karma stopped a long time too, has passed, yet no, the right result will come. So this is one of the most important passages in his text. When he says it, he's saying karma, the action. I think of it as, so again, take this example of killing somebody. I think I killed somebody, now it's done. Now there's an imprint, and then it later ripens. But its cessation, its ending of the action, is only in relation to a particular person experiencing it. Something being, born and abiding and disintegrating is something that occurs over a period of time. And time is only something that exists in the experience of somebody who's experiencing a passage through time. So in this sense, what we call the past is only the past in relation to us experiencing now as a present. From its own side, you can't say it's gone. It's not there anymore. It's not conventionally speaking to say that the past still exists. Conventionally speaking, I can say I exist now in the year 2020 and the year 2019 is gone. But if we try to find that and pinpoint what that is, that only exists from a particular perspective. So because it doesn't adhere inherently, it's still potent. It's still a functioning thing. I'll come to this in just a minute when I talk about Tsongkhapa and how he interprets this verse. But even though there's no basis of all, there's nothing carrying it. There's not like I have this aspect of myself, this storehouse within that's carrying all these seeds. So even though the karma stopped and a long time has passed, there's still some connection. I can't escape the consequences of my actions because there's nowhere to escape to and there's nothing to escape from. It's only something that I can talk about conventionally. So the right result will come from that. It will bring a result. Every cause has to have a result. So Tsongkhapa, as I think many of you will know, was the founder of the Gelug school, which we belong to at our monastery at Sera. So he comments on this verse, and he has a unique way of interpreting it that's different from any other Tibetan scholar. So I'll also mention, as you see, Mipam is another Tibetan scholar. After I describe Tsongkhapa, I'll just mention one other way that people interpret it. But Tsongkhapa interprets Chandrakirti to be saying that the past is a functioning thing. So this is different from any other Buddhist school. All the other Buddhist schools say that the past is a permanent thing. Something that's permanent doesn't function. It's permanently gone. So in this school, it's not, the past is not something, it's not like we can time travel to the past. But the present is affected by the past. Things that happen in the past affect us now. And for something to have effects, it has to be a functioning thing. A permanent thing cannot bring effects. So it exists as a potency in the present. And when we say potency, it's what we call disintegratedness, or what Tsongkhapa called disintegratedness. So this is a very difficult topic. I think it's one of the most difficult topics in all of the Middle Way school, in Tsongkhapa's philosophy. But the idea is that something is disintegrating moment by moment. So if we have an object, like a pot, every moment it's continually changing. So we can't pinpoint a time, okay, it exists and now it doesn't exist. It's just a continuum of something that's continuously changing. And when we say it's gone, now it's the past, but that process of change the continuum of that is still going on. So at the time of the pot, it's disintegrating. After the pot has existed, its disintegratedness is still a functioning thing. So Tsongkhapa, he then gives some quotes from Nagarjuna himself, trying to show that this was actually part of Nagarjuna's philosophy, even though in Nagarjuna's text, things are often very hidden, and it's not so explicit what he means. So in his text, the 60 stanzas of reasoning that I mentioned earlier, Tsongkhapa said, Nagarjuna said, exhaustion of the cause brings peace. So it makes it sound as that something ceasing can have an effect. So Tsongkhapa talks about this like, he says, he gives the example, the food ran out, so the boy died. So in this case, the food running out is the end of something, but it has an effect. It caused the boy to die. So we could say, well, actually, no. I mean, you say that conventionally, but really what caused the boy to die was starvation. It's conceptually, we can talk about the lack of food, but it's not like the food that nourishes him that's a physical thing that we can point to. But actually, as we talked about earlier, nothing that exists can be pointed to or found under analysis. Conventionally, we can talk about it. So if conventionally we talk about things as having effects, and we can verify that he died because the food ran out and not because he was struck by lightning, then it has a conventional existence. So conventionally, the action gives its result. And the disintegratedness itself, although we can't find it anywhere, it still has functions. The other Buddhist schools, other than the consequentialist school, all think that this, what we call disintegratedness, is permanent. It's similar to the past. It can't have any kind of effect because it's just a lack of something. But here, they say it's a lack of something because we can't find it. But Tsongkhapa is saying that just because we can't find something, we can't find anything under analysis. So that doesn't negate it being a functioning thing. He also gives a quote from Sutra, the Buddha talking about, the Buddha says, from birth's condition, death arrives. We have the 12 links of dependent origination. And we say birth is the cause of death. So it implies that death is a functioning thing because it's an effect, even though death is really just the disintegratedness of a person. The disintegratedness of a pot is the pot having broken. The person having died is the disintegratedness of the person. But the death itself is a functioning thing. And death also brings an effect. Because we have the 12 links of dependent origination, you might know that death is the 12th one, the last one. That then causes the first one. It causes ignorance again. So death causes both the next life, and death causes continuation of ignorance. Even though when we talk about death, we can't pinpoint it anywhere. So likewise, when we talk about the past, an action that I did in the past, conventionally I can talk about it being in the past. Yet at the same time, it's only past in relation to my present experience. I'm only experiencing the world in a fragmented way. There could be a relation between something in the past and something in the present. So if I think about it as I created an action and therefore it leaves this imprint on me, and I carry that into the future and I experience it, that has all kinds of conceptual problems. And that implies that there's some kind of self. If it's rather understood that everything is connected with each other, and it's only because I'm interpreting it as I'm this solid person traveling through time who has an action in the past and experiences it in the future, that it appears to me that way. But actually, there's a direct connection, that something doesn't have to travel on something, that there's a direct connection between the action and the result. This is different than the other schools, in that it posits that at the very time of experiencing the result, the virtue or non-virtue directly causes that result. It doesn't cause it through the intermediary of me carrying it. It has to do with the way that things in the universe are connected with each other, and the way that when we talk about time, that the past and the future are only distinct from each other from my experience. They can actually interact with each other in a particular way. So this seems to be Tsongkhapa's way of understanding what Chandrakirti is talking about. But as I said, other Tibetan scholars interpret it differently. So one is Ju Mipam. Some of you might know, he's a Nyingma scholar from the 19th century. He's often referred to as Mipam Rinpoche. So his understanding is that when it says it does not cease inherently, it's saying that a seed and a sprout and a karma and its result are alike and not inherently meeting. So I'll talk about this also when we talk about the actual text. I'll talk about the way that cause and effect, the question of how a seed and a sprout can function in emptiness. But the question is does a sprout, when a sprout causes a seed, can you point to a particular time when it's a sprout, and a particular time when it's a particular time when it's a seed, and a particular time when it's a sprout? You can't ever say now it's no longer a seed, now it's a sprout. If you really get down to it, there's an arbitrary distinction. We make up this distinction of there's this, then there's that. It's a continuum. So likewise, to think that there was an action in the past and that stopped, and then there's a result in the future and that all of a sudden came out of nowhere. It's only that something has a very subtle continuum that's continuing. It's going, that it's not that it at one time is one thing and one time is another, but it gradually turns into something else. So this is how, again, Ju Mipam interprets this verse of Chandrakirti. The 639 is, the chapter 6, verse 39 of his text. So also, I think we can see this in Nagarjuna's own philosophy. In his text, Root Wisdom, he says, it once was here, but now it's gone. This is the view of severance. So severance means a nihilistic view. The idea that this thing, this experience I had in the past, I had it once and now it's gone. This is often how we think. We feel very nostalgic for the past. But that's only based on my particular conception. I'm very attached to myself as being a particular person right now. And I experience life and time in a very fragmented way. Conventionally speaking, yes, 2019 is gone. This person I knew before, they died and they're gone now. But at the same time, it's only based on my experience. If I could experience all parts of my life in a cohesive, integrated way, there wouldn't be this sense that this was here before, now it's gone. And likewise with everything in existence, and we look at something in the past in the universe and say, this was the past of the universe. It really depends on human beings, therefore deciding that what time is the present, somebody experiencing the passage of time. We have this idea that there was a big bang a long time ago and the universe gradually evolved and then we emerged. Conventionally that's true. But the question is, what if there was no human being or no sentient being to experience anything? In what sense was time even passing? How can we say that there was just this, we say a frame of reference, as though there was somebody with a video camera. We can just see the universe passing through time, with nobody to experiencing it passing in that way. But not even talking about the universe itself, talking about our particular lives. We experience, one time I was 10 years old, and now I'm 20, and now I'm 30. As though these exist in discrete ways. It's like this. I'll talk about this billiard balls. In classical physics, we talk about everything as like a billiard ball, a hard little object. It's like there I'm 10, and then there's a break, and then I'm 20. So we say now. What do we mean by now? It's only because we're experiencing as though this moment now is distinct from everything else. Now this might sound okay. It's just like a thought, kind of a trick of mine. But what does it really matter? What does it have to do with any experience? But this comes when we talk about concentration. If we gain greater concentration through meditation, it's possible to change our experience. And if we can experience our life and ourself in a more integrated way, without this sense of fragmentation, then this is ultimately the antidote to desire. We can talk about, I want all these things and I don't have them and I'm so unhappy. But when for example, my mother lived before and she died now, and I'm so happy that she's not, I'm so sad that she's not here anymore. That only is dependent on my experiencing myself as existing in a particular way. If I experienced my life as a totality in an integrated way, there wouldn't be any sense of loss, because there wouldn't be a sense that it was once here, but now it's gone. That's only this based on my mind being trapped in a particular, very limited level of experience. So this is why emptiness also, of course, has to be combined with meditation. And this, again, is something in the last talk, I want to talk quite a bit more extensively about that. But I think this particular verse is very useful just to reflect on these words. I think Nagarjuna's words can be very powerful. So then Chandrakirti goes on to talk about an example. In the very next verse, this sense of things, something that ceased but still can give an effect. So he says, first, seeing pretty objects in a dream, on waking, still a fool will feel desire. Like that, not having an inherent being. Karma that is stopped still brings results. So in his auto commentary to his text, he elaborates on this point. He says that a person has a dream of a beautiful woman and he feels desire. Now he wakes up, and if he's a fool or even just a normal person perhaps, he still feels desire. And he thinks, well, that woman was so wonderful, I wish I could be with her, even though it was just a dream. So then he goes back to sleep because he wants to dream about this again. So even though this thing that he experienced is gone, he grasps at it as if it exists. And that grasping has an effect now. So even though something no longer exists, it can have an effect, it can bring an effect. And this has to do with memory. So as I said before, I think that memory is very fundamental in this understanding of karma. And that ultimately how memory is stored and where memory is stored, if it's stored somewhere, is very similar to what we're talking about when we talk about karma. The difference is that when a memory comes to conscious awareness, it's experienced as an internal experience, right? Whereas something ripens as a karma, it's experienced as an external experience. But in either case, it's something that's been stored that then ripens as some kind of experience. And Chandrakirti also at this point, then he quotes a sutra, teaching of the Buddha, Sipe Powido in Tibetan, which would mean like the transference of existence. So it's how somebody is born from one life to another. So the Buddha is explaining to a king that exactly this example, that imagine somebody in your kingdom is a fool and he's having this dream of this beautiful woman. And he wakes up and he thinks, oh, she was so beautiful, I wish I could be with her again. And he goes back to sleep again and dreams about her again. And the Buddha says, now likewise, when somebody approaches the time of death, then past experiences that they've had come to awareness. And death is like waking up from a dream. But because they're still attached to the dream, they go back to sleep again. And this is like being reborn. And Tsongkhapa says in his commentary on this that it's not the same as memory. It's similar to memory, but it's not actually remembering, in the sense that, so I do an action and that action ripens the time of death and then projects a future lifetime. I don't literally have to remember the action. It's a slightly different function, but it still has to do with the way that something is stored outside of conscious awareness and then ripens as a future experience. So I think this middle way presentation of karma is quite something to meditate on. I find it quite profound. I certainly don't feel that I have a full understanding of it. I'm presenting what I've gained from our study of it. But it definitely seems that Chandrakirti had a very good point about the Buddha's teaching, that really when we talk about karma and memory, to understand them, we can't understand them without understanding emptiness. It's two parts of, two sides of the same coin, that we can't pinpoint memory. We can only see how these things work and what mind is, because he actually uses the same kind of emptiness reasoning to talk about the level, how the how the mind functions, what the mind is. The relation between the mind and matter, and the relation between past and future experience, it comes from understanding emptiness. And Tsongkhapa is very explicit about this. He says that there's 8 distinctions of Chandrakirti's interpretation of Nagarjuna, this consequentialist school. 8 ways that if we understand his understanding of emptiness, then there are 8 questions within Buddhist philosophy that will be understood. And one of them is the relation between the past and future. One of them is self-cognition. How is the mind aware of itself? And then other aspects of Buddhist philosophy. So, as I said before, dependent arising and emptiness function together. We can't understand one without understanding the other. And when we talk about emptiness, we're talking about the relation between things, talking about how things can connect with each other. So now I finished the introduction. We can finally get to the text. So we're about halfway through this second talk. So I've put together in Nagarjuna's text 7 different subjects, ways that we can talk about. So it's 70 stanzas, the name of the text. It's actually 73 stanzas. And I'm not going to go through every one. In a short teaching like this, I can't. If I just went through every stanza, it would be confusing. They're very deep, and to just breeze through them would kind of be a waste of time. But I want to focus on particular stanzas and what they're talking about, and then hopefully, on the basis of that, if people are interested, they can read other parts of the text. So that I've broken it up into 7 different subjects. The first one being the 2 truths, and then within each subject, I'll also, as is relevant, talk about other texts of Nagarjuna where he talks about these subjects, and also other people, especially Chandrakirti, and how they interpret what these things mean. So I'll try to, there's 7 subjects. I'll try to finish a couple maybe now in this session, and then if possible, finish the rest of them tomorrow morning, or at least most of them, and then tomorrow afternoon, talk about some concluding points and what this all means for practice. But first I want, obviously to talk about the text itself and the philosophy it presents. So as many of you might have heard about this philosophy of the 2 truths. So when we say 2 truths, it means that 2 ways of looking at things. Something is true from one perspective. Something that is true from one perspective is not necessarily true from another perspective. And this has to do with, I mentioned at the beginning, that this text 70 stanzas is a digression from Nagarjuna's Root Wisdom, chapter 7, which is about birth, abiding, and disintegration, how things come into being, abide, and disintegrate. And in this chapter, he basically negates that there's any such thing as birth, abiding, and disintegration. So then the question would arise, well, if there's no birth, abiding, and disintegration, are you saying nothing exists at all? And so the response is that there is birth, abiding, and disintegration conventionally. On a conventional level, that's true. But ultimately, it's not true. So there's 2 different levels of it. So a very helpful example of this is given by Buddhapalita, another commentator I mentioned on Nagarjuna. And he talks about 2 men in a temple in India. And they're looking at a large painting on the wall of a deity. It's this deity holding a trident, which some of you might know is Shiva, the Hindu deity Shiva. So one person says, oh, that's Vishnu. Look at that great picture of Vishnu. And the other person says, what are you talking about? That's not Vishnu, that's Shiva. So they start arguing with each other. This is Vishnu or Shiva, this and that. I can tell you, it's Shiva because he has a trident, this and that. So then the temple caretaker comes along and says, why are you getting so frustrated? It's just a painting. What are you arguing about? So conventionally, the person who said it was Shiva, he was right. But ultimately, it's not true. It wasn't really Shiva, that's just a painting. So on a conventional level, there is right and wrong. It's wrong to say it's Vishnu. It's right to say it's Shiva. But at a deeper level, if we step back from it and look at what it really is, it's neither of them. Both of those are just conventions. So this philosophy talks about two levels of truth, the conventional and ultimate truth, but I've translated here as concealer truth, because that's actually what it says in Sanskrit and in Tibetan. To conceal the truth doesn't mean the truth conceals things. It means that it's true for a concealer. And ultimate truth means it's true for an ultimate. And in both cases, it's talking about consciousness. It's true for a concealer consciousness, or it's true for an ultimate consciousness. A concealer consciousness is our normal everyday consciousness. Things appear as in a certain way to them. So, birth, abiding, and disintegration. From a seed comes a sprout that appears to my everyday consciousness, and that's true for my everyday consciousness. But an ultimate consciousness is a consciousness that analyzes the nature of existence, and it sees that neither of these is findable under analysis. So in the face of that consciousness, these aren't true. They don't exist in the way they appear. What we mean by true is something that exists the same way it appears. So concealer truth is an object of realization of conventional analysis. I analyze, does a barley seed give rise to a barley sprout in a barley plant? Yes, that's true. And barley doesn't give rise to wheat. Barley seed does not give rise to wheat. So that's conventional analysis, in that it's analyzing the way things exist on a conventional level. It's realized dualistically. When I experience barley or wheat or whatever, I experience it as I'm here and I'm looking out at that thing over there. So and also I experience things as fragmented. There is the seed and there is the sprout, and they're two different things. It's true for a concealer or an obscurer, so it's true for my concealer consciousness. But it's false or deceitful, meaning that it doesn't exist in the way it appears. If I really analyze it, I can't find it. You remember this example earlier? For example, the United States. It appears to me, when I think about it, it's so real. I miss being in the United States. I miss my country. But there's, this hippie, Wyatt, he goes out on a motorcycle and tries to find the United States because he feels like, there's the real America. I want to find it. But everywhere I go, it doesn't actually live up to my expectations. It appears to me in a particular way, but it's deceitful because it doesn't actually, I can't find it when I look for it. What it feels so solid actually is not there. And it's variegated, meaning that it experiences all these different things. This is true here, that's true there. There's different laws in different countries, and different people wear different colored clothing, and everything's all these different things in the world, and they seem totally unrelated. So then ultimate truth is an object of realization of ultimate awareness or ultimate analysis. So this is something that when we actually analyze, what is it really? When I talk about a boat, what is a boat? As I said it before, okay, yeah, it's this thing that floats in water, right? But is it the planks that make up the boat? If one of the planks breaks, is the remaining plank still a boat? How many planks have to break before it's no longer a boat? All right, or we could argue, what is the difference between a boat and a raft? And some people might have different opinions on that. But when we really try to analyze it, we can't pinpoint one thing that's ultimately a boat in all perspectives. That doesn't depend on something else for being a boat. Once a boat sinks, then it's underwater and it might become a home for some fish. So it only depends on being a boat as people using it as a boat. It depends on a particular consciousness labeling it in a particular way. It doesn't exist ultimately from its own power and its own side, we'd say. And it's realized non-dualistically, ultimate truth. So when we experience ultimate truth, we don't experience it as I'm the one experiencing it and it's out there. It's experienced in a sense of merging. It's the example in the text that's often given is water poured into water. It's like water experiencing water. There's no separation between conscious observer and the object being experienced. It's true for an unmistaken awareness, which means a meditative awareness that analyzes the way things are and sees the final way things exist. This is a very advanced level of meditation. And it's true, it's undeceiving. It exists the way it appears. This is the only thing that can exist the way it appears because it's the only thing that's ultimately true. Everything else, is only true on a conventional level. And it's uniform, one taste, meaning that, okay, yeah, a table and a chair are two different things. But when I really analyze them, the ultimate nature of the table is no different from the ultimate nature of the chair. They're both empty of inherent existence. So everything ultimately, is, they say, one taste. It's like when somebody experiences emptiness, it's as if they no longer experience the world in a fragmented way. They experience as a coherent whole, where everything makes sense and everything seems connected to each other. So we have root wisdom. I mentioned that this 70 stanzas is a digression from chapter 7, and specifically it's said to be a digression from this verse, the last verse of chapter 7. Like illusions or like dreams, or like a town of ghosts. Like that was said, abiding birth. Like that, destruction too. So was said means the Buddha said. The Buddha talked about that we create karma and we experience the results. So we create it and then it abides for some time and then it ceases. But it's just as illusory as a dream or a town of ghosts. If we actually try to find out what it is, it's just an appearance to mind. So then in the very first stanza of 70 stanzas, then Nagarjuna, he elaborates on this. Abiding, birth, destruction, being. Non-being, the worst, on par, the best. The Buddha taught in worldly terms. He didn't teach authentically. So when the Buddha taught all of these different things, he taught that things, a person is born, a person abides for some time and then they die, they're destroyed. Being means existence. Things exist, or some things don't exist. Some things once existed and no longer exist. Some things are the worst, and the worst, he means negative actions. So killing somebody is the worst. It's a bad thing to do. And on par, some things are just even. They're not good or bad. Just many actions we do are neither karmically good or karmically bad. They're just neutral actions. And the best means virtuous actions. So it's great to practice charity, and it's great to meditate and think about things. It's great to protect morality, all of these things. So the Buddha said that's a great thing to do. But when he taught that, he was only teaching in worldly terms. He wasn't teaching authentically, meaning he wasn't teaching the way that it exists from his perspective. In the Buddha's perspective, there isn't this divide between this is good and this is bad. This was born, this ceases. When we ultimately analyze them, we can't pinpoint them. Again, we have to be very careful. It can be easily interpreted as nihilism, as saying that the Buddha is saying there is no good or bad. Whatever we do, it doesn't matter. That's not the point at all. It's saying that ultimately, we can't pinpoint them. So he taught in worldly terms. And the example is given is as if somebody goes to a barbarian land and they teach barbarian people. They have to speak in the language of the barbarians. They can't speak in the Sanskrit language or whatever language they use in India, because people won't understand what they're talking about. So for example, if you meet people with a particular worldview, you have to speak to them on that worldview. People who believe that the earth is flat, and they say the sun will rise tomorrow, they can understand what you're talking about. And you can talk about them and you can have a conversation, and you're correct to say the sun's going to rise at 5 o'clock and it will set at 7 o'clock, even though their conception of that is totally wrong. Their conception of what it means for the sun to rise and what it means for the sun to set is totally wrong. But still, it's correct to say it'll rise at 5 and not say it'll rise at 9. So we could talk to them in their language in a way that they'll understand. And likewise, the Buddha taught to us in this way that we experience things as fragmented. And we experience things as having an inherent self and separate from other things. And so he taught this way in order to help us to gain correct concepts and be free of wrong concepts. He taught to us that morality is a good thing and killing is a bad thing. But if we attach too strongly to that, then we start thinking that these things exist inherently, and then we attach too strongly. Well, then there's this karma, and I correct morality, and therefore it creates this, this seed of my consciousness that exists, that I can find it. Then we're getting too much into thinking that things exist in a solid way, that they don't exist. So this is the first verse of 70 stanzas, and it's generally considered one of the two most important verses. This and verse 64, which I'll talk about later, are really said to sum up the entire teaching. That all the rest of these are just elaborations of this same insight, that there's two different ways of looking at it. Things exist conventionally, and we can talk about them. But when we ultimately analyze them, we can't pinpoint them. So also in Root Wisdom, in chapter 24, Nagarjuna talks about the same thing, about the two truths. He says, when teaching Dharma, Buddhas rely authentically upon two truths: concealer's truth, the worldly one, and ultimate truth, the highest one. Whoever fails to understand divisions into these two truths will fail to understand the deep, the suchness that the Buddha taught. Not based upon conventional terms, the highest meaning can't be taught. Not realizing the highest truth, you can't attain nirvana's peace. So he's saying this first verse is exactly the same meaning as the first, as the one I just showed, that the Buddha teaches two different ways. He teaches about the concealer, or the conventional truth, and he teaches about the ultimate truth. But if somebody doesn't understand this distinction, then they won't understand the deep, meaning emptiness. The suchness, this again means emptiness, that the Buddha taught. So the Buddha, he has to teach upon conventional terms. Not based upon conventional terms, he can't teach the highest meaning. If he doesn't speak in a language we can understand, if he just were come to say everything is empty from the get-go, from the very start, nobody would understand what he was talking about. But at the same time, not realizing the highest truth, not realizing emptiness, you can't attain nirvana, which is the goal of Buddhist practice. So in order to get there, you have to start with conventions. So Nagarjuna is defending his teaching on emptiness. He's saying that, yes, the Buddha did teach that way, but it doesn't negate that things are empty of inherent existence. If you try to argue with me and say that it's wrong to say that everything's empty because the Buddha taught arising and abiding and destruction, that doesn't harm my thesis. It's just it's a stepwise progression. It's a conventional way of understanding things that brings us to a higher understanding. So then we have verse 2 of 70 stanzas. No self, no non-self, no self and non-self. There's nothing to express. What's expressed, nirvana-like, all things by nature, emptiness. So here, it's interesting because oftentimes at the beginning of a text, in the second verse, in Buddhist texts, the writer will then say, I'm going to talk about this and this. But here he says, there's nothing to talk about. He's basically saying that all I'm talking about here, when you actually get down to it, it's like nirvana. And so what we say nirvana here, it means, many of you might know that nirvana means the extinction of suffering and the extinction of afflictions. This is what we call, the thing to achieve, that's nirvana. But then we have what we call naturally abiding nirvana, which is just the nature of things, which is similar to emptiness. So not synonym for emptiness. So everything in its natural state is like nirvana. And this isn't just a metaphor. It also has to do with what nirvana really is. And one of the later subjects will be specifically about this cessation, this nirvana, because it's understood that really, if we think about nirvana as something to achieve, like I'm going to get this in the future and then I'll have it, then we're missing the point. That it's this very nature of things, this emptiness, which is the natural nirvana, which is what we have to recognize in order to achieve the nirvana that we're trying to achieve, the freedom from suffering. So then there's a later stanza that is just useful because in this context it's related. All things exist, things don't exist and don't exist as well. These things the Buddha stated for a purpose aren't known easily. So Nagarjuna is saying that if we look at the Buddha's teachings, he said a lot of different things that would seem to contradict each other. Sometimes he said all things exist, karma exists. Sometimes he said things don't exist, that everything is empty. And sometimes he said they both exist and don't exist, which is understood here to be that they are both conventionally existent, but ultimately non-existent. But if we take them, the word literally, they seem to contradict each other. So the Buddha stated for a purpose, meaning that he said each of these things for the purpose of teaching a particular person. They aren't known easily. If we take them too literally, if we get too attached to his words, then we'll misunderstand the point of what he's saying. We have to analyze more deeply to understand the Buddha's message. So that's the first subject, the two truths. And the next subject is what we call the four extremes, which means four extreme views. Four extremes means that we say this is the middle way philosophy. It's the middle between extremes. So an extreme view is a wrong view. It's exaggerating something in a particular way. So here are the four extremes, means that four extreme ways of understanding cause and effect. And the reason he focuses on cause and effect is because, generally speaking, it's said that the reason people think things exist truly is because cause and effect functions. This is the strongest evidence we would say to have that things exist truly. If everything was just created by my mind, then it should be just like a dream. In a dream, things don't have coherence. A barley seed doesn't have to bring a barley sprout. It could bring a wheat sprout, or a barley seed could bring an elephant, whatever. Nothing has any connection with each other. So things exist. If we see everything in the universe, we can measure it, and we can make predictions. So it's not just made up by our minds. It exists, in a real way. So this is a very subtle thing. Conventionally, yes. Conventionally, one thing is right and one thing is wrong, and we can predict a cause of an effect from a cause. But if we think that then means it has this kind of solid ultimate existence, then it's actually projecting too much onto the object. We're then making things out to be too independent. So the understanding is that if it did exist, if something was born, a cause brought an effect inherently, then it would have to exist in one of four ways. If something, was born from a real thing, it would either have to be born from itself, it would have to be born from something else, it would have to be born from both itself and something else, or it would have to be born causelessly. If it can't be found to exist in any of these ways, then we have to say it doesn't inherently exist. Because if it inherently existed, we have to be able to find it. And you see, I've paired this with different Indian philosophies, because the way it's presented is that these are the views of different philosophical schools. Ordinary people, when they think about cause and effect, they don't think that it's caused from self or other or both or neither. They just think it's a cause and effect. It's only when we start making philosophies. But the point is that if we tried to analyze it, we'd have to come to one of these four conclusions. If it really existed in the way it appears to us, in an inherent way, it would have to exist one of these four ways. So therefore, by negating these four ways, we can start to understand how even our ordinary experience must be mistaken, because it can't be reified. It's like I see a picture on a screen. I think it's a real person. I don't think, oh, is that person there or behind the screen? I don't even know it's a screen. But then I analyze it and I find that they're not there anywhere. Then I can come to the conclusion there's not actually a person here, even in my ordinary appearance, because if there was a person here, when I search for it, I have to find them in one of these ways, and they don't exist in any of these ways. So it's just an appearance. So birth from self is usually equated with the Samkhya school, which was a major school of philosophy in ancient India. And you see I have this picture here. Sage Kapila, he was said to be the founder of the Samkhya school, although that's not really entirely sure when he existed or if he was the founder of the school. And here is a little picture of the very, very elaborate philosophy. I mean, you can't read any of this, but just to show you that they have a very elaborate picture of how things exist. They usually talk about, on a general level, there's what we call the Purusha, the self, which is equivalent with consciousness and being, her person, that experiences both prakriti, the sort of the substance, the basic substance, and then all the manifestations of that. So it's like there's sort of basically three things going on here. There's me, and I'm experiencing the kind of the ground of being, this nature of things, and I'm experiencing all of its manifestations. So I'm mistaken in two different ways. I'm first of all mistaken to think that the manifestations are all separate things. Everything that exists is just like a manifestation of this same nature of being. And so everything's experienced dualistically, but it all dissolves into this basic nature. And then I identify too strongly with all of these external things. Actually, who I really am is just this consciousness that's not tied to any of these external things. And even external, when they talk about that, they also mean like emotions. So emotions of pain and pleasure and happiness and anger. These are all also actually considered to be form, physical form, and they're not identified with the pure consciousness. So if I identify too strongly with these, I suffer. If I recognize myself as just who I really am, I can be free of all of that. So in a lot of ways, it's very similar. It has some important distinctions to Buddhism, but this form of thinking was very common in ancient India. These were ways of meditating. And so a lot of Buddhist texts are arguments with Samkhya philosophy. And what they accuse the Samkhyas of is believing in birth from self. Now, for Samkhya philosophy, this doesn't literally mean that a seed comes from a seed or a sprout comes from a sprout. But it means that a sprout, it can mean one of two things, really. One is that when we really get down to it, the seed and the sprout are of one nature. They only appear as different because of our distortions. It's like the same thing masquerading as two different things. And then likewise, the sprout exists within the seed as in a non-manifest way. Now, I think this again might sound very esoteric, but there are some ways that this philosophy can make sense. So one thing I think about is DNA. We think about that, there's a particular, how is it that a particular, folding of protein then gives rise to a particular formation of a being? Where does that exist in the protein? This is still actually a question. Although we kind of assume, well, genetics explains why I have particular character traits, physical traits. But really, how is it that that's the case? Where in their protein? And why is this protein then cause me to have a particular shape of nose? If there's some kind of code, which is how we understand it, but who's reading the code and how is the code accessed? And one thing now is that we know from, reading DNA, I can read this particular kind of code in DNA means big nose, and I can then predict someone with this DNA. Although it's not so clear, it's not like literally you have the gene for a big nose, but there's an interplay of different genetic factors that I can then predict an animal who has this same, genetic coding will have a big nose. But if I didn't know before that this was correlated with big nose, I couldn't actually read it. This is something in science, we cannot actually read the code or know we know that this particular coding is correlated with that, but if we didn't know a priori how that was connected, we can't just read and say, oh, this is the code, and therefore we know what this animal would look like if we'd never seen this code before. So it's a question of how did that exist? This is what the Samkhas were asking about. They were asking, why does a barley seed give rise to a barley sprout, not a wheat sprout? Because there's not this wheat sprout, or the barley sprout, it's not there you can't see it in the seed, but it has to be there in a non-manifest way. Otherwise, how is it transformed into that? How does it know to do that? So also, some of you might know about the history of, um, of science. We have in the 17th century, the Dutch scientist Leeuwenhoek was his name, who started using the microscope to look at different things, like look at cells and look at blood. And one of the things he looked at was male sperm. And he saw, we had already known, okay, there's semen, there's this substance, but no one had ever looked at it closely and say, look, there's this little fish flying around in there. What's that? And this was quite surprising for him. So how is it that this little fish thing evolves into a human? So naturally, the theory that first came out in science was that, there's this little sperm with a head. Inside the head, there must be a little human. It's like a homunculus, like a very tiny person. Because how else does that thing grow into a person? How does it know to grow into a person and not to grow into a cat? So in this philosophy, the idea is that everything that is going to emerge already exists in a potential way, in a non-manifest way, on its cause. And therefore, when we see something, it looks like this thing's causing this, but really that thing is just manifesting out of that. So then we have birth from other. And don't worry, I'll talk quite a lot more about how they negate this philosophy, because that's the important point here. But just to go through the four, we have birth from other. So most Buddhist schools agree to this. They say that things come from other things. A seed gives rise to a sprout, and the seed and the sprout are inherently different things. We can pinpoint how they're different. The sprout does not exist in a non-manifest way in the seed. They're two different things, and we can define them and separate them. And then there's birth from both, which is Jain philosophy. So here, when they say birth from both, it's a little more subtle. It's an understanding that things both have, like a seed, a sprout comes from a seed, which is something that's one with it, in the sense that it substantially becomes the seed, or becomes a sprout. But it also comes from other things like sunshine and water, which are other. They're like cooperative conditions, but they don't actually become the sprout. Likewise, if I make a pot, the clay that goes into the pot is the self, because that clay becomes a pot. And the person making the pot is other. He doesn't become the pot, but it's still a cause of the pot. And then we have causeless birth, which is attributed to the Charvaka or Lokayata school, which was one of the few schools in ancient India that didn't believe in reincarnation. So it's hard to say. I'm not sure if they would say that a sprout doesn't come from a seed. But the main thing they're saying is that our experiences of happiness and suffering have no relation to our past actions. This is what they mean by causeless. It's just random. So the understanding here is that if we can negate each of these four, then we can infer that things must not exist in an inherent way. So the first, in stanza 4 of 70 stanzas, he references this. Since being exists, being isn't born. By not existing, non-being's not born. They're inharmonious, not both. Unborn, it can't abide or cease. So in the first stanza, he's talking about birth from self. If something already exists, then it can't be born, right? Something that already is here. To be born, something has to first not exist and then come into being. So since being exists, being isn't born. By not existing, non-being's not born. So if something is totally non-existent, how does it come into existence? Does something come from nothing? And then they're inharmonious, not both, meaning that something can't come from both self and other, because those two things are inharmonious. It either has to come from one or the other, but not both. And if something isn't born, then there's no abiding and no cessation. So again, we have to understand this is talking about things, conventionally, yes. Conventionally, a sprout didn't exist last week and now it exists. But if we look at the way that it appears to our mind, this is the important point. When we talk about things as if they had some kind of solid existence, then if we look at how that appears to our mind, it looks as if it exists independently. And if it did, it would have to either be something that always existed or something that came from nothing. And it can't be, neither of those two things works. So then he goes on to negate these different things. So first we start with birth from self. If something was born from self, how would that work? So here I'm going to talk significantly about, or substantially about Chandrakirti, because he is much more elaborate in his description of this. So this comes from Chandrakirti's Supplement to the Middle Way. So just to mention, we have about 20 something minutes left. So I'll go through this birth from self this afternoon, and then tomorrow morning I'll start with birth from other, which is more extensive because it's harder. It's really the main point. So I'll go through birth from self, and if we have questions, I have time, hopefully we can have some questions. So to negate birth from self, Chandrakirti in Supplement to the Middle Way, he goes through this step by step. And then you see this at the top of above the verse, I have a little explanatory point. That's actually Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa in his commentary, he explains what each verse means. So the first is that if a result was born from a cause that is one nature with it, birth would become meaningless. And then Chandrakirti says, if that arose from that, there'd be no quality. So he means that quality here means no point. What's the point? Who cares? It's like, what would it mean to say that this arises from itself? What would it mean to say it was born and now it was not born and now it's born? It was already born before it was born because it was the thing that gave birth to itself. It's meaningless. Then we go on to the next part. Birth from something of one nature with it is contrary to reason. So not only is it meaningless, but also if we apply reasoning to it, it causes all kinds of logical fallacies. What's born to once again be born is too untenable. If we examine what's been born to once again be born, in this whole world we wouldn't find the birth of sprouts and such. Incessantly until time's end, a seed would still be born. So also I mentioned earlier, Chandrakirti employs very complex meter. You'll notice here there is some meter. There's an equal number of syllables per line, but he uses this very complex style. But if we look at very carefully what he's saying, it's not so complicated. So what's born to once again be born is too untenable. So not only is it meaningless, it's also untenable for something that was born once to once again be born. If we examine what's been born to once again be born, so if we examine this thing called birth from self, if we really get down to what it is, in this whole world, we wouldn't find the birth of sprouts and such. Meaning that if something rose from itself, then a seed would just keep becoming a seed again and again and again and again. The sprout would never be born. So incessantly until time's end, a seed would still be born. It would just be a seed over and over and over again. So, we have some philosophies, for example, that tried to prove the existence of God. And we'll say that God is self-arisen and then gave rise to the world. But then this same fallacy might come about. If God is self-arisen, then God should keep giving rise to God again and again and again, and not give rise to something else. So then the Samkhya supposedly gives it a rebuttal, so dispelling an attempted rebuttal. So what they would argue is that, well, no, a seed, it doesn't keep being reborn again and again, because when the sprout arises, it stops the seed existing. It terminates the continuity of the seed. But then Chandrakirti says, how could it be that itself could terminate that one? So he says that he's saying, if you say that a sprout and a seed are one nature, then they should be the same thing. So how can something terminate itself? You said that there was a sprout that existed in a non-manifest way in the seed, and that's one nature with the seed. So where is the thing that's terminating the other thing? If something terminated something else, you have to say, okay, there's one thing over here, one thing over here, this thing comes and knocks that thing off. Then he goes on If cause and effect were of the same nature, then a seed and a sprout would have no difference in terms of shape, color, and so forth. So Chandrakirti has, apart from its creative cause, a seed, a sprout shape, and its color, taste, capacity, and ripening would be not. So this is approaching the argument from a different way. First, it was showing specifically that it's untenable for something to be born from itself. And now he's saying if you say that the cause and effect are of one nature, what are you talking about? If you say that a seed and a sprout are of one nature, are you saying they're the same thing? So you're saying, but in that case, a sprout's shape, a sprout's color, a sprout's taste, its capacity, like what it can function to do, and the ripening of the sprout, they would all be meaningless. It would be anything different than the seed. The sprout couldn't be a different color than the seed because it's the same nature as the seed. But then the person might respond, well, it's the same nature, but it's manifesting in a different way. But then the response is, if you say it leaves behind its old self and becomes a different one, at that time, how is that the truth of that? So somebody might say, well, it left behind its self as a seed and became the self as a sprout. But then what do you mean by saying they're one nature? Where is this thing that is inherent in both of them? When you get down to it, where is there something that's both in the seed and in the sprout that's the same nature? The Samkhya might argue that it's like you have a piece of gold and you make a pot out of gold, and then you break it down, and then out of that gold, that was a pot, then then you make a table. So it's the same nature, just manifesting in different ways, right? So that there is something to be said for what they're saying. But then the question comes about, what does it really mean to say that they're one nature? It leaves behind its old self and becomes another one. But at the same time, the gold is now in a different shape. It's something different. Conventionally speaking, it's something different. So in some sense, they're mixing up the ultimate and the conventional truth by saying that they're the same thing. Ultimately, you can't separate them, but conventionally, it's two different things. So furthermore, both seed and sprout would be similar in either existing or not existing at the earlier and latter times. So if you say that here a sprout and seed aren't different things, just like a seed, what's called a sprout, would not exist from then. Or else because the two are one, just like a sprout, a seed, would two exist from that time on. As such, I don't accept. So again, if you're saying that they exist, that they're of one nature, then a sprout should exist at the time of the seed, and a seed should exist at the time of the sprout. And it's questionable what the Samkhya would say to that, because they do say that the sprout exists in a non-manifest way at the time of the seed. But when we actually think about it, what does it really mean to say that the sprout exists at the time of the seed? If the sprout existed at the time of the seed, then everything that ever was going to be born from the seed should exist at the time of the seed. And therefore, it becomes kind of meaningless. And a seed should still exist at the time of the sprout because they're one nature, the same thing. So the gold that was made from a pot into a table, the gold's still there. But what is that? Who cares? What does that really matter? It's like if you try to make that therefore say that everything exists in everything else, it becomes basically a meaningless statement. Okay, I can say everything exists in everything else because everything in the universe, there's all this matter that's just mixing with each other, but what does that have any meaning for anybody? How does that help anyone to think that way? So then we have Dharmakirti. So Dharmakirti was another Buddhist philosopher, and as I mentioned, a lot of Buddhist philosophers argued with Samkhya, so he also does. So he uses this 100 elephants per blade of grass. So he's saying that if you say that everything that exists as an effect exists in a non-manifest way at the time of a cause, well, look, there's a blade of grass, and then an elephant eats it, and the elephant, digests it, and then gives birth to a new elephant. So that piece of grass was the cause of that second elephant, that baby elephant. And then that baby elephant gives birth to another elephant, and so on to 100 elephants. So all those 100 elephants all existing in a non-manifest way on that blade of grass? And then it becomes, ad infinitum, we'd say, that everything that exists has to exist on this one blade of grass in a non-manifest way. So you're going to point to it. You can take a magnifying glass and point to the grass and say all of these different things exist. So the point is that, yes, conventionally speaking, this grass can give rise to all these different effects. But if we try to reify that and say, therefore, all these different effects exist in a non-manifest way on the grass, it basically becomes meaningless. And therefore, then we say birth from self, if everything that was ever going to be born existed in a non-manifest way at all times, then everything would just be mixed up. There wouldn't be any differentiation of things in the universe. So this is the end of talking about birth from self. So I think we have about 15 more minutes. So I'm hoping maybe if there's time, people have any questions, then I can have some idea of kind of if people are following me. I can't see most people on the screen, so it's hard to know if everyone's looking perplexed or if people are getting something out of this. So it would be helpful if people have any questions, and then tomorrow morning we can continue on with birth from other. And of course, you can ask questions about anything I've talked about either this morning or this afternoon.
Hello, I have a question.
Yes.
In the first session, you had mentioned about the connection between the philosophy of emptiness and memory. So,
Yes.
so if we have to, of course, that was an elaborated, complete thing in itself.
Mm-hmm.
But somewhere maybe I missed out on something that I couldn't absorb it properly. So
Right.
if you can probably conclude it specifically, the connection between these two, the philosophy and the
Yes.
memory.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think, as I said, that's a very difficult point in their philosophy, but basically, it's related to what I was talking about karma. That if we have this conception that memory has to be stored somewhere and found somewhere, then we can't find it. When we try to pinpoint memory, we have to actually step back and understand, see that our particular understanding of the nature of mind and the nature of time is limited. So if we try to see it as the memory stored in this part of my brain, that's because I have this sense that there's a person that's carrying the memory. Whereas if I understand that mind itself is not something that can be found within space and time, then there doesn't have to be this divide between what happened in the past and what happens in the future. And thereby, it's not so much that the memory is stored somewhere as that, you know, what I was no longer experiencing, I'm now experiencing again in a manifest way, but it from its own side didn't stop existing. I mean, this is a very hard thing. And I think, um, if I can't exactly put it in a more clear way. Maybe it's because also from my own side, it's not entirely clear. As I said, this is something that I'm still thinking a lot about. But I think it's to think about memory as similar to the understanding of karma. So if we study about Madhyamaka philosophy, to think about what is meant by this disintegratedness that Tsongkhapa is talking about. Um, and if that's very hard at the beginning, as I said, it's very useful to think about the mind-only philosophy, because I think that actually is more accessible at the beginning. So you could think about that. But generally, as I say, in Chandrakirti's viewpoint, it seems to be that the question of where is memory stored comes from the perspective of having a limited understanding or limited experience of space and time.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Venerable,
Yes.
someone has asked a question.
Okay.
It is,
Okay.
does the Buddha have mind? Have a mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, there's actually different ways to answer that. And in Tsongkhapa's philosophy, absolutely yes. Tsongkhapa understands it that, our minds at this moment are polluted. And so we remove the pollution, but the mind itself doesn't disappear. It's like, when you remove the clouds from the sky is still there. But the Buddha's mind, is very different from our minds. It's not limited in the same way, but definitely the Buddha does have a mind. There are some passages both in sutras and also even in Chandrakirti's own texts, which seem to imply that mind, as we talk about it, no longer exists for a Buddha. And some schools within Tibet, especially Sakya school, the Grompa was a great Sakya scholar. They talk about the Buddha as no longer having mind and mental factors. But Tsongkhapa doesn't agree with this. And he says that this is to be understood that the Buddha no longer has conceptual thoughts. Things are no longer experienced in a fragmented conceptual way. They're experienced as a totality, but they're still experience. If there wasn't any mind, then who would be the Buddha that's benefiting us? How could the Buddha communicate with us in any way? And furthermore, your mind is not something that can be destroyed. If the Buddha had no mind, it would imply that you have a mind now, and thereby something you do destroys your mind. But that can't happen because events within mind are experiences of mind. So any particular thing you experience can't destroy the experiencing aspect itself. It's like you have a dream. You can't get harmed by something you see in a dream because it's just your imagination. So anything that appears to mind can't actually cut the severance of mind itself. And again, that comes back to that mind isn't something that can be located within time and space. Thereby, no matter what happens within time and space, it doesn't actually affect the mind.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if you see me. I am not sure.
No,
if
I don't see anybody.
Oh, sorry.
But you can ask. It's fine. I can hear your voice.
Okay. Yeah. When we try to exercise seeing, in the waking state, everything is a dream.
Yes.
Are we following the mind only school?
Actually, so both the mind-only school and the middle way school say that everything is dreamlike. I mean, it was the Buddha himself who said that. It's a difference in how they understand how it's like a dream. So it's not just a matter of what metaphor you use. It's a matter of understanding what that metaphor means. So in the mind-only school, things are like a dream because, things exist, things seem to appear externally. So like when you're in a dream, it seems like, oh, there's that thing way over there. But really, it's just in your mind, right? There's no real distance in your dream.
Yeah.
And likewise, if you look in a mirror, they say, you look in a mirror and it seems like things are way out there, but it's just right there in the glass in front of you. So likewise, when we experience our day-to-day life, things appear to exist. We say distant and cut off. They both appear very far away and they appear to have no relation to us.
Yeah.
But that's an illusion, like a dream. The Madhyamaka school, the middle way school, also says things are like a dream, but in a different way. They don't say there's no external existence, but they say that it's not findable like a dream. In the same way that in a dream, when you try to pinpoint what is this thing really, how does it exist, you can't find it. The more specific you get, the more ephemeral it becomes. In that way, it's like a dream. But it's very important to understand how it's like a dream, because if we just say everything is dreamlike, it's all a dream, nothing matters, I can do whatever I want, this is not understanding properly that it's not that it is a dream.
It means we use analysis.
Yes, we use analysis to use the metaphor of a dream to understand things. We say it's like a dream. It has certain qualities that are like a dream, but it's not exactly like a dream. It's different than a dream. A dream is a metaphor to help us understand, because a dream is something that also depends on conscious experiencer. to
But I
exist.
remember one time after a retreat, Lama Zopa Rinpoche told us,
Yeah.
we were walking around and he said, try to see everything like a dream, like not really
Yeah.
real.
Yes.
So in this case, it was without analysis. So he was kind of making an exercise which would be more a mind-only school, isn't it?
I don't think, I mean, I don't know what Rinpoche
No?
meant, I can't say for sure, but I don't think he was saying you shouldn't analyze. I think that's a misunderstanding. Rinpoche
Okay.
is also very clear that we need to analyze. When it says look at like a dream,
Yeah,
it
yeah,
doesn't
yeah, yeah.
space out and think, oh, I'm in dreaming. It means to
Right.
analyze, it's like a dream. Look at it very closely,
Okay.
think about it.
Okay. So always analyze. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Venerable, you can stop the screen share
Oh, yeah,
so
yeah,
people
sure.
can see you.
That's a better idea, yeah.
And if you want to see others, you can choose the gallery view.
Oh, okay. Gallery.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we could have a couple more questions if people have time.
Yeah.
Hi. Oh, sorry. You go, whoever that was. Or maybe I'll go. Hi, Venerable. I've got a question about the mind only, the mind based. What, like mind and mind based as well. I don't know if they map neatly, but yeah, could you?
Sorry, I didn't hear. Could somebody repeat the question? Because I didn't get any of it, actually. It all cut out.
Yeah, I think you
Yeah,
broke
excuse-
up. You'll have to repeat it. Sorry.
Oh yeah,
Your-
Yeah.
my
None
mic
of
is
it.
that better? Yeah,
You started
I'll
to break.
type it. Oh yeah.
Does someone else have a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
So for me, all of your reasoning about the birth from self was very clear, but for me was very fast because probably I don't have enough baby. So I was wondering where we can find the same, where I can go deep
Yeah.
and find your same reasoning, like in the form you express, like a debate kind of reasoning.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to approach that. I mean, I don't know how much you've studied in terms of Buddhist philosophy before. You know, it really depends. You know, some good introductory ways. You know, there's some introductory books I'll mention on the last day. But for example, there is, you know, there's a book by Thupten Jinpa. It was a Self, Reality, and Reasoning in Tibetan Buddhism. This really goes clearly into Tsongkhapa's philosophy of the self. You know, the deepest analyses of these are in Tsongkhapa's own work, like in his books, The Great Stages of the Path, and especially in his book, Illuminating the Thought, it's called. But these are very difficult books to read if you don't have a basis in Buddhist philosophy. So, you know, I think it really depends kind of where you are. I mentioned before about the 4 schools of Buddhism, and it's really important to understand the other schools. You know, I'm giving this teaching here on Middle Way, you know, kind of as an introduction. But if you want to understand it more deeply, it requires a lot of grounding in the basic Buddhist philosophy. Otherwise, a lot of these things, the kind of all these terms that you might not know about. You know, but if you want to just get some basic things about this, also there's the Geshe Tashi Setting's book, Emptiness. So, you know, this teacher, he has the 6 basic books. But actually, I think the best thing, as I said, I will try to kind of provide a resource list at the end for people. And if people can give kind of, you know, clearly what level they're at, I can recommend different things that you might want to study about.
Thank you.
Venerable, can you read Rob's question in the chat box?
Okay, let's see, chat.
Is the clear light mind the same as mind basis of all?
Oh yeah. Oh, that's a very good question. So actually it depends. In the Gelug school, no. But you know, if you studied in Nyingma, they have a different meaning when they talk about the mind basis of all. So I won't answer according to them, but I'll just point out that my answer will be the Gillick interpretation. And so if you've heard a different one, it might sound contradictory. But in the Gillick understanding, we say mind basis of all. This is talking about a consciousness that is substantially different from our mental consciousness. And this is something that we don't actually accept. You know, it's part of the mind-only school, but the Gillick interpretation is to accept the middle way school and say that that's only a stepping stone for a greater realization. Whereas the clear light mind is talking about a very subtle level of the mental consciousness. It's not substantially different. You know, it's more like, you know, if you have an ocean, you go more and more deeply into what is the nature of the water. It's the same water, but you go more and more deeply into it, into its nature, and examine it. And this comes in Tantra. I mean, in the sutra system, when they talk about clear light, they're actually just talking about the emptiness of the mind. But in the Tantra system, it's talking about, you know, the very subtle level of consciousness. But it's, as I say, it's not substantially different from our waking consciousness. It's just that it's more subtle. It's not like in the mind basis of all, it's like there's a break. There's two different things that are substantially different.
Any more questions?
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Okay. So following Rob's question, if there is not the clear light mind as the mind basis of all, how do Gelugpa scholars admit that the mind from the from ordinary people to the Buddha's mind?
Mhm.
If there is not a base, how do the mind transform from ordinary people to Buddha?
Okay, so again, in the Gillick school, the clear light mind, and we're talking about the Tantra system here, the clear light mind does continue on until the Buddha. So it's not that they're saying that doesn't happen, but they're saying that the mind-only school understanding of a mind basis of all is too coarse, that they have this sense of this inherently existent thing that we can find that's different than our ordinary mind. And it's the clear light mind it's a more subtle way of understanding this. It's similar, but it's saying that it's not like there's this gross mind that just ceases and then the subtle mind, the mind basis of all goes on. It's more saying that, you know, all along the nature of the mind was clear light. So for example, to give a concrete example, in the mind-only system, mental afflictions like desire and anger, their continuum is severed, and that does not continue on to the Buddha, whereas the mind basis of all does. Whereas in the Tantra system, mental afflictions like desire and anger actually become the mind of the Buddha. So this has some practical applications for how we meditate on these afflictions. That it's saying that, as it says in the Uttara Tantra, this text you might know by Maitreya, the Sublime Continuum, that it says that the Buddha nature, or the essence of the Tathagatas, it's really called the Buddha nature, it exists. He says underneath the afflictions, and what that means, it's hard to say, but it's like a kind of esoteric term that somehow the afflictions themselves, if you turn them over, if you see them in a different way, they are themselves the nature of the Buddha, which is very different than in the mind-only schools saying that the afflictions are something you just get rid of, and then this subtler level of mind thereby manifests as the Buddha.
Does someone else have a question?
Yes?
I just wanted to know if the teaching are going to be recorded, because for me, I probably will need a second, second time to listen,
Yeah.
again.
I think, yeah, they're going to be available on YouTube afterwards, I believe.
Okay, thank
And
you.
also, as I mentioned, we'll have a forum online, so if people have further questions as time goes on. Hopefully I can elaborate more, if there's things that you didn't understand.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
You should have been sent an email with a link for the first recording,
Mhm.
and another one will be sent for this one.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Regarding the imprint, the cause and effect of the karma
Yes.
in the dream.
Okay.
That when you mentioned about the story of that guy who's dreaming about the beautiful girl,
Yeah.
I'm wondering about the imprints that would happen and how is it going to function? Because it's a dream.
Okay, so I think there's two different things here. I mean, the example that's being given is a dream. It's an example for our existence. So generally speaking, just in a general way, in the Buddhist teachings, when we're dreaming, we are creating karma, but it's very weak karma. So for example, if I kill someone in a dream, that is karma, but it's called karma that is, what do you say? Karma that is performed but not accumulated, meaning that it's only a partial action. So it has some effect, but very weak. Because everything that I do in a dream still is imprinting on my mind. I can still remember my dream. Even if I can't remember it, it's still imprinted on the mind at some level. It's even possible that if I forget a dream, I might remember it later. If I'm meditating, I remember a dream that I once had that I thought I'd forgotten about. But so it's still there somewhere. But the point that's being given here is an example. It's not saying that when somebody meets a beautiful woman in a dream, that thereby that's creating the karma for his next life. It's given an example that just like somebody meets a beautiful woman in a dream, and then he wakes up, and even though he was dreaming, you say he's a fool, so he still thinks she was so beautiful, and he goes back to sleep so he can meet her again. In the same way, we have these experiences in our lives, even though it's like a dream. Then when we die, that's like waking up. But we're so attached to the experience of living that we go back to sleep, which is like being reborn. And we then have these same experiences continuing on.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So I think we can do our dedications.
Yeah, let's do that.
Wait. Where are we? Here we go.
Okay. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the four continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this is the Buddha of the end and offer it. May all transmigratory beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Mandala Kam Niryatayami. So then, scroll down, please. Okay, so this is a verse from the Guru Puja Lama Chopa by the fourth Panchen Lama. I think it's good we do this because it's giving a prayer to realize the meaning of Nagarjuna's teachings. Samsara and nirvana lack even an atom of inherent existence, and cause and effect independent arising are unbetraying. I seek your blessings to discern the meaning of Nagarjuna's thought, that these two are mutually complementary and not contradictory. Okay, scroll down, please. Okay. May the precious supreme bodhicitta, not yet born, arise. May that arisen not decline, but increase more and more. Okay. Is there anything more?
No, that's it.
Okay. Okay, well, that's good. We can do a short dedication. So thank you all for coming. And I hope to see you tomorrow morning. I know, as it seems, this talk was probably quite difficult. Some of these points. It's important to remember that what I just went through in this teaching on birth from self, for example, we'd spend weeks and weeks debating that in the monastery. So just to go through it in a few minutes, it's really just to give a general idea of what he's talking about. Because if you just read these words, they can be very esoteric. And as I said at the beginning, we don't want to have unrealistic expectations. It's not like, I'm going to be talking about this and all of a sudden someone will have this click and you're free from samsara. This isn't the point. But the point is that, we get some idea of why this could be meaningful and why this is something worth dedicating time to think about more. So one of you asked the question of what you said earlier, seems so meaningful. How could I learn more about it? That's the idea, is that we think, okay, this is actually something worth putting time and effort into. So then we can, have some motivation to, move forward with this path. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again tomorrow on the same time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.